Simple things like that you can do to try and improve your business. If I was going to spend money, it would be really around understanding your ore body, understanding your reserve, and then really how that reserve is then put together in a mine plan. Whenever you're operating offshore, you need to make sure you've got a very reliable person who really understands the money side of things. When you look at NPV, the bigger you go, the more attractive things become. But the larger you get, the more risk you have attached to that largeness. So for me, step-by-step scale up or growth is a more prudent way to go. People have come to terms with how to get to 2030, but I don't think people have started to think about how to get to 2050. And I think to get to 2050 is a very different picture.
And now joining us, our guest, Ian Pearce, who is independent director and advisor. He has a lot of experience working with major corporations and also small companies. So Ian, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much, Anya. Good to meet you. Yeah, I think when you look at mining, one of the biggest things we're always managing are uncertainties. And it starts from when you look at the geology. You drill off the deposit. Your drill spacings are usually pretty wide because it costs a lot of money. And it really is around how do you use that data or that information to get better control as you move that drilling from a resource into a reserve, which is really the economic position you want to be in, where you say we can make money on it. We cannot make money based on the deposit. So I think that's the reality of mining. Has been that way for forever. But I think in today's world, and I call it the digital revolution, I think there's a lot of exciting tools and processes one can use in mining space to run your businesses, define your businesses, and run your businesses very, very differently.
What would be the strategy, I guess, like when you have already operations or like you establishing the operations, right? Like you have short-term challenges and you have like long-term challenges. What would be the strategy to overcome, let's say, short-term strategy, short-term challenges, and what would be the priority list, I guess, how to manage that?
Well, I'd say that in most mining companies, your biggest cost are around labor and energy. So in a short term, you'd really want to understand how you can actually affect that. So you'd want to draw up what I call value driver trees around those aspects, and then decide what are the areas that you can focus on. Where's the biggest bang for your buck? How can you optimize? And that also goes about really, probably when you're in that situation, you have limited access to capital. So it's really around making sure that you're putting capital where it's bringing you the most benefit. So in the short term, it's really around trying to manage the efficiency of the operation. And ideally, what you're trying to do as well is all operations are mapped on a cost curve. So for every commodity, for every supply, there's a cost curve, whether it be copper, whether it be nickel, whether it be whatever commodity in, all producers will fit on a cost curve. And typically in the short term, you want your business to be resilient through the cycle. So you want to move yourself to the lowest point on the cost curve as possible. So you need to look at those levers that can actually move you down that cost curve. And as I said, the first lever in the short term, I'd say, is really looking at how can you do things more efficiently. So really looking at efficiency as such. And again, this digital world offers us many tools where before many operations were done manually and not integrated. And today you can integrate decision trees by doing it through automation or through a digital platform. Many times mines are located in very remote locations, and it means you have to fly people in and fly people out, which is expensive. You have to house them, you have to put them in camps, you have to transport them. So for me, that is a very expensive operation. And so now with many of the tools available, you can start thinking about how do you do some of this work remotely. And that also changes the gene pool that you are looking to bring to your business. So in the past, things like data scientists were not really a skill set that was associated with mining. But today, because you've got data and you want to actually use that data, um, you can actually now hire those kind of skills into your business, and even things like monitoring your equipment, condition of your equipment. So there's things like condition monitoring now, where you can actually automate a lot of the equipment at site, but you can actually monitor that equipment remotely. So that maintenance function that would have been done at site can now be done remotely. So there's simple things like that you can do to try and improve your business cost position by finding ways to remove that labor from site and employ the labor where the labor wants to be, which is usually in an urbanized environment. So that's the sort of thing you could do.
In terms of, again, like priorities, right, for technology, like we were talking about that there is a various tier of optimization that can be done. There is AI, there is blockchain technology. What would be the number one on that list of the technology that you can use for your operation in terms of the optimizing your operation?
So, I think, I'm a metallurgist by background, and many years, people have worked on trying to improve the recovery of metal out of the feed that's been sent to the processing facility. But I'm a big believer that really it's around ore body knowledge and really going upstream to get a much better understanding of your ore body. Because the process plant is generally a fixed asset. So you can't, it has some flexibility, but it's not that flexible. And so for me, if I was going to spend money, it would be really around understanding your ore body, understanding your reserve, and then really how that reserve is then put together in a mine plan. And your mine planning is going to be very important. Whether you where you think you've got ore, where you think you've got waste, how you remove that efficiently. That is your biggest bang for your buck. Because if you put waste in your ore stream, you end up diluting. And if you leave ore behind in your waste, you've actually lost revenue. So for me, it's really that front end is very, very important to understand your reserve, understand how your mine plan is working. And then today you are able to do dynamic modeling or dynamic work around that, where you can do simulations and you can actually say, well, what happens if this happened? What happens if that happened? And you can start understanding by looking at those simulations what you can do to actually address some of the potential challenges you're going to have in the future.
Yeah, that's actually what also like kmine does. I think in our software we have like different types of scenario in terms of the cost, in terms of the just mining operations, in terms of the mine design, what will happen when you tinker with the parameters. And I think it's very important to have appropriate risk management of your operations. And in terms of obviously if we talk about small companies, right, they also face challenges like regulatory compliance. They face challenges like compliance with international and local regulations, right? So how do you navigate that, and what would be the upfront management in this sense, and like upfront assessment of like, okay, I'm going to this place, that's what's gonna happen, that's what regulations I'm gonna face?
Well, I think the world has changed quite dramatically since COVID. So, I think when you go back to the early 2000s, when globalization was rampant, I think globalization was very much driven by economic considerations. But post-COVID, when suddenly everybody realized how reliant they were on other countries and other jurisdictions for a supply chain point of view, I think the globalization has become quite geopolitical. So I believe that geopolitical considerations are more important today than they've ever been. And that goes around the whole topic, not just of the political landscape, as you mentioned, some different countries having different standards, but it also goes back to the ESG agenda that investors are looking for. So if you are pulling on money from, mature jurisdictions like North America, or you're putting on funds from Europe, then no matter where you're operating, they would expect you to abide by the standards of those countries where you're actually accessing capital. So that's the driver. Not you definitely always want to be on side with your host country and make sure that that's a minimum you meet. You don't want to fall foul of regulators where you're operating. But I think there's an overarching and also changing landscape where this whole ESG agenda is moving, and the standards. And for smaller companies, it's very difficult to really get to grips with the standards going on. So, big companies can afford to have their in-house lawyers and to have legal teams that are on their payroll. But smaller companies need to outsource that. And to outsource it, you need to have a really good general counsel or somebody that's on the workforce that in your company. And then you should be able to pick and choose the consultants and or the advisors, whether it be legal advisors or not, to help you prepare for where you're going to be going to. And I think that word prepare I use, whether you're going to go build a project in one of these jurisdictions or whether you're going to go buy a company and integrate it into your business, you need to do your process, you need to do your due diligence, you need to do your definition work up front, and you need to cover all those aspects. You understand the geopolitical environment, understand the regulations. And again, as a small company, you're not going to be able to have that all in-house capability. So I'd suggest that you've got to use outside resources to help you augment a very small but efficient internal company resource base.
How do you think, obviously, you're Canadian, so it's not directly, you're not directly impacted, but right now, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Part of his agenda is drill, baby, drill. How do you think, the next 4 years will affect just mining regulations on international space and in Canada, particularly, and on Canadian companies as well?
Well, I'll start off with anytime there's uncertainty from a market's point of view, financial markets don't like uncertainty. So whether it's not knowing what direction things are going to be going in is problematic in itself. Whether it goes in the right direction or the wrong direction, just not knowing which direction it's going in is problematic. And so I think that uncertainty creates a stall of investment where people are, you just take around energy transition, and the previous government or the present government in the US appears to be quite positive towards supporting that energy transition. And what we hear is maybe a pullback from that. So you think about the capital inflow. Many people sit on the fence waiting to see what's going to happen. And so that sitting on the fence is not good for our business, because we need to have certainty so we can actually go ahead or not go ahead with investment decisions. So I think that's one thing that will impact, is that just that uncertainty, and then whether you need to invest or not invest. And I'm not talking about just in the US, I'm talking about globally, what the impacts could be, because the US is still one of the largest, or is the largest economy in the world. I think the second part that's going to have on the world is this whole discussion around tariffs and what they'll do to supply chains and the ability to bring in or export materials. So that has a big impact on the sector as well. And again, those uncertainties doesn't bode well for giving investors a clear picture of what your company will be doing in the future. So I think it is all around uncertainty. One is around capital flow and whether it's going to be positive for the mining space, and the second would be around the impact it has on supply chains and logistics, etc.
If we analyze, obviously Trump already has been president before. We already had 4 years of his presidency. what would be, you think, changes in terms of the market from that presidency to now? And based on that presidency, what can we expect?
I think it's, first of all, I'm not a politician, so
Yes, of course, of course.
the political sort of machinations that are going on in the US is not my forte. And I would also say that you can't use the previous term as a predictor of this term, because I think certainly even as we see the appointments of different people into government today versus what happened in the last term, the pace and the changes are dramatic. So you can't use the previous 4 years as a predictor for the future 4 years. And I think that, again, is what creates a lot of uncertainty, which is not good for the markets in general.
If we analyze like the Canadian market and let's say how Canadian companies do business in Canada versus abroad, what would be the major takeaways from your perspective? Obviously, you have projects abroad, so what would be the key points to look out for, and what is the benefits and I guess disadvantages of having a project abroad?
So I think, when you go from a local business into a global business, where you're going from your backyard, where you hopefully know what you're doing, you've got your connections, you're very familiar with doing your business in your own country. When you go overseas, I think there's a need to have a very good understanding of what you're just about to go into. And one of the things to consider is timelines or zones. So when you stretch yourself, say, for instance, a Canadian company that decides it wants to go and operate in Australia, your time zone difference or the gap in time zone is massive. And so that offers a challenge to being able to control or have oversight on the company. And so for me, in that situation, you always need to make sure you've got good leadership talent that are leading the operations that you're going to have there. And one of the key positions for me is who's in control of the money. So whenever you're operating offshore, you need to make sure you've got a very reliable person who really understands the money side of things, and that can, make sure there's good controls, good oversight, and good governance when it comes to money. I think the other thing too is sometimes to try and mitigate the risks associated with being in another country. One always needs to find out who are the governments of influence in that country, and to build relationships with those governments so that you've got good insight from those government relations about what's happening politically in the country. And the third thing I'd say is potentially look for partnerships. A lot of times it can be very attractive to have 100% of the benefit, but that means you're 100% responsible. And so local partners sometimes can be very helpful in helping you manage some of that local content that needs to be understood, and pushback that might need to happen at the time. So those are things I would suggest one needs to consider.
We talked about some of the short-term challenges. How do you, if we talk about long-term challenges for a company that aiming to scale the operations, what would be the challenges and how to overcome them?
Well, I think to your point about scale, I think one of the big mistakes or one of the big issues that a lot of mining companies make is they look at NPV as a driver, which is an important metric. And when you look at NPV, the bigger you go, the more attractive things become. But the larger you get, the more risk you have attached to that largeness. So for me, step-by-step scale-up or growth is a more prudent way to go. So go in at a reasonable size and then have strategies of how you're going to grow that business from going in small. And the reason why I say that is, two things that drive us that we don't have a lot of control of. The one is the ground. Nature has provided the ore, and the ore body will be what it is. And so you can't change that. If the grade is there, that's great. But if the grade is not there, you can't change that. So that's one very big uncertainty you have. And the second other big uncertainty that has a massive impact on your business is the metal prices. And so thinking about how you're going to navigate those two pieces is very important. And so I think you've got to look through, again, looking at a life of asset or a life of mine type of scenario where you, and it's very difficult today if you're a public company because the market is looking for a report out every quarter. So the market is very short term in its thinking. But a mining company has got to be run on a long-term basis. And so you really have to have that view of the long-term view of the life of mine. And that long-term is important because there might be times when you might need to deploy capital, whether you have to replace equipment, where you have to do maintenance, big expenditures of maintenance, whether you have to do pushbacks in the mine, which is going to require capital to move overburden or waste so you can get to the next ore body. These are big capital-intensive programs that in a life of mine plan would be planned out. But one needs to understand what you have around, and this is why flexibility and being able to move your plans and understand how you can move your plans is very important, because you may have a very downturn environment for metals when you just need to do that pushback, and therefore you don't have access to the capital. So you need to plan these things in front. So you either have to do it through your balance sheet. So that means you need to make sure that you've got a revolver or some sort of debt structure where you can access capital easily when you get into that situation. Or if you can, when metal prices are really good, try and bring some of that work forward and try and do that work earlier so that you can actually offset those additional costs at times when the metal environment is in your favor. And the last piece I'd talk about would be exploration. So exploration for me is like R&D is for pharmaceutical companies. The day you start mining is the day the ore body starts to decline. And so you need to find a way to replace the reserves and the resources that you've taken out of the ground the year before. And so that is also a capital intensive program that can't be done on a budgetary basis. It's got to be done on a campaign. So you'll say, okay, this is an area that I think could be the future location of an ore body. You can't do that on a budget. You have to do that on a campaign, a geological campaign where you go and access capital. So I think the planning out of those sort of things need to be done and need to be understood. And the acceleration and or the deceleration and or the funding of those, you cannot rely on the metal prices and the revenues you think you're going to get in that year. You've got to think about other vehicles, other ways to fund or to exercise those activities so that your life of mine plan is staying solid and it doesn't get impacted by not doing these things. Because sometimes if you don't do the pushbacks or you don't do the stripping at the time or early enough, then you impact your ability to actually mine at a certain rate because you haven't got the work fronts open to you. So very important to do that through a life of mine planning process.
A majority of exploration companies, they don't reach their operation point because they don't raise capital, or maybe because the commodity that they were exploring were not enough in quantitative basis for them to actually move the project. But what do you think are the major mistakes that small exploration companies that move towards operations make during the process of raising capital?
There's a real dislocation between the narrative we are hearing. So we're hearing that the world's population is growing. We're hearing that urbanization of the population is going to go from in the 50s to in the 60s. That means 10% of the population still needs to get into urbanized environments. We're hearing about the energy transition. We're hearing about circular economies. So this is all positive for the resource sector, for the supply of commodities. But there's a dislocation because there's not the access to capital. And so the ability to source capital is very constrained. And because that constraint, and because many companies are relying on public markets in the past, and I think this may change, I think people may decide to start accessing capital from other sources. But because capital is traditionally being sourced through public markets, the ability to raise the right amount of capital to do the right amount of work does not happen. And so I think projects are not as well defined as they should be. And a good example was I was at a conference in Vancouver recently put on by the Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy and Petroleum called Mineral Resource, Mineral Reserve. And it was an interesting paper presented there where the person had done a study on the distance between holes that are drilled when the mine is put into operation to get definition of the ore body versus the distance between holes that were done to prepare a study for the project. And the distance on average for studies was between 60 and 80 meters, I think. And the distance that were needed in operations were 20 and 30. So you can see there's a massive dislocation around the amount of effort that's done in defining the ore body. Now, that's only looking at it through a lens of drilling. I think there are now many techniques, innovations, that can help you better define ore bodies by not just doing drilling. But I do, and I think it's gained through using the digital world. But that, for me, is one of the foundational issues, is that the shortage of capital is meaning people are not spending the right amount of money in defining projects, whether it be around the ore body, whether it be around the processing and the recoveries, whether it be around commissioning correctly, whether it be around ESG, whether it be around what demands are going to be put on them from the environmental needs, whether it be put on from social needs, etc. So I think those things all become quite impactful, and that's why a lot of these projects struggle to demonstrate the economics that they started with because of all those factors.
And I mean, you mentioned a very interesting thing that you can actually, estimate basically minerals not only through drill holes. And in terms of like mining innovations, what do you think are, like we talked about, there are like blockchain technologies, there is AI, there is automation. What will be the technologies that are useful early on and later on? And which technologies are you using kind of like on your project, like for sure?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are technologies that are available today, and I think in the geological space, we've moved quite far ahead when it comes to how geology was done in the past and how it's done today. So you can put in instrumentation down boreholes that you drilled. You can get information around the ground conditions. You can get information around hydrology. You can get information around even where the ore body may be moving in a northeast-west direction based on using some sort of sensing systems that you can put down the holes. You also, some companies are looking at mapping with XRF the cores that come out of the ground. So using direct technology to actually try and map the core. So there are numerous tools in development and will be coming to market fairly soon that'll help you better define those ore bodies. And then, even if you just took the data that you've got and then put that into a model, and then you did simulations where you use machine learning and artificial intelligence to do different scenario planning. When you think about how difficult it is for a human being to do a new mine plan, for instance, where if you had it all embedded into a platform, then you could, play out different scenarios and saying, well, if the ore body was over here but not over there, if it wasn't continuous, if it was, non-continuous, you could start doing scenarios which can help you understand the uncertainties, and that will inform you where best to actually go and drill. So a lot of times, the drilling that we do is around proving out where the ore body is. But, you also need to understand where things aren't or where you don't have information, because that's just as important. You might be missing something in the areas where you don't have information. So, I think those are the sort of things you could do. And then again, I'm with a startup where they've developed technology where it puts sensors on the shovels. So once you're in mining, you can actually dig the ore, and it'll tell you what the grade of the ore is in that shovel. And that's very informative now, because you can use that now to reconcile back to your block models, and you can go reconcile it with your mine plan. So that reconciling, and that can be also done by putting the same sort of instrumentation in the process plant. So you can reconcile process data with your shovel data, with your block model, and on real time, you can update those now because it's all automated. So I think there
Yeah.
are tools there you can use to go and do that.
Yeah, I know that even like our software we use, what we have done is, let's say we read the information from the sensors that is on drilling machine, and actually we could move the machine where the deposits are, because we could analyze the grain size and the granular information of what's going on, and that's why you will do like more precise drilling. But do you think, I guess the logical question for me, do you think there is a certain resistance in terms of the geological consulting, in terms of just professional analysis of the information that we receive from early sampling, that like most people that do, okay, here's your drill plan, and people don't really expand their mind, and like do something else and just kind of like apply this template. It's like, okay, here's your drill plan, drill here, and don't think about any other technologies that could be actually more precise and can help them to have like more accurate drill plan.
Yeah, I think there are practices that have been practiced in the industry for decades.
Yeah.
And I think because in the past they've been accepted, there's a big resistance to change in the industry. And the industry is well known to be quite conservative. In fact, I joke with some of my investors because I always say to them, the mining industry always rushes to be second, but nobody wants to go first, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is, and I think again, when you look at the junior companies and the mid tiers, and in the space, there are a few major companies that are very much self-sufficient. But when you look in the junior space, they don't have a lot of capacity to actually take on some of these projects because they're very lean organizations. So again, in one of these companies I'm advising, we're finding that when we go to start have conversations with the companies around data science and data collection and data sorting, they are pulling on our people to do the work for them because they don't have the talent within the company. So there is that issue where there isn't the capacity to take on some of these new projects just because they run themselves so lean. So I think there's a need for collaboration is a word I use a lot. So the big mining companies can afford to do some of this stuff. And if we could share it, or if we made sure there was an open platform where others could actually learn from that, I think it would help others to adopt technology easier.
And if we talk about, major companies, we talk about corporations, they don't really have like problems of budget, right? Like but what are the challenges that they facing when it comes to mining operations, especially when it comes to mining operations in challenging environments? And it's my understanding even though they have this unlimited budget, they do not implement all of these like innovations that can help them actually operate efficiently. Why is that? And what would be, I guess, the advice to major corporations in this sense? Like if anybody was listening to us who is a manager and who can actually make a change in terms of their corporation to operate it more efficiently.
I do quite a lot of work here with startups, and one of the things I've found is when you're looking to find a customer who's willing to talk to you about technology, you must find a customer who's in pain. And there's a very good book written called Good to Great. And one of the biggest evils of great is good. So with many of these companies, because they're making money, things are good, things are okay, there's nothing problematic. There's an inability to desire to be great because good is good enough. And I think that's a challenge for leadership, and that's where leadership has to come in. I always believe that a manager's role is to create constraints for their teams so they can be innovative about finding solutions. I don't think
they should have a purpose. They should have a
exactly.
purpose to overcome something at least. Because
Exactly. I
there's
mean,
no development without crisis.
yeah, I think you've got to, they always talk about the burning bridge or the burning platform, right? Mm-hmm. So I think management's or leadership's job in those situations where things are comfortable and everything's running very well and everything's good, you need to create constraints to motivate people to think about things differently. And when you have those constraints, you have to think outside the box, how to solve these problems. I think the other thing too is there was a bit of a panic a few years back when suddenly everybody realized, we had this warming up of our planet, and people wanted to address that. But and if you just ignore that and just say we need to run our businesses more sustainably, we just had to say that. People have come to terms with how to get to 2030, but I don't think people have started to think about how to get to 2050. And I think to get to 2050 is a very different picture. And I believe that to get to 2050, we need new knowledge. We need new ideas. We need new ways of doing things. And I think that's something that a lot of people haven't started to think about, again, because we are so focused on that next quarter, we're focused on that next half-year result or whatever the case. We're so focused on the short term that it's very difficult for teams that are very lean and very small to sort of lift up their heads and think about that long-term picture. That'll be challenges we have to solve today to be able to get to 2050.
Is there any technologies that is now trending with this within corporations that, let's say, small companies can't afford?
I think there are technologies. I've mentioned this technology that's called that can be put in shovels. This XRF application package that gets put in shovels. I think that technology is available today, and basically, you can buy that technology and pay as you go. So you don't have to have any upfront capital. It doesn't interrupt your business when the shovel comes out for maintenance. The application package gets put on the shovel, and the shovel goes back into business. So there are technologies like that which are, in some businesses we're talking tens of millions. In some businesses we're talking hundreds of millions of difference in money a year. So when you think about those numbers, it can take a business that's a third quartile or a fourth quartile producer down to being a second or third quartile producer, which means they can survive the cycle. Or it could take a company that could be going out of business. It could keep them in business. Or even when you think about ore bodies, when you're able to do better control of your ore body, you might be able to change the cutoff grades and bring in a different configuration of that ore body and use more of that ore body because you've got better control of it. Where a lot of times you don't seem to have that control based on a very rudimentary block model approach. And so because you don't have that control, you work with a much tighter cutoff grade where you might be able to release that cutoff grade. Or even if you use automation, you might be able to go through various phases of increasing or reducing cutoff grades because you've got knowledge and you can actually control it. So I think there's an example of technology. I think another example I'll give you is in the lithium space, because today lithium brines, the most proven way of extracting lithium is by putting them in these big salars, so these big ponds, and evaporating the water off and getting the crystalline material.
In situ.
There's a technology I'm associated with, which is actually looking at extracting the brine, absorbing the lithium onto an ion exchange bead, and then pumping the brine back into the ground or into the lake. So there's no evaporation needed. There's no environmental impact. And so I think there are those sort of technologies that are in development today, and they should be commercialized within the next 3 to 5 years. And those are very interesting technologies, which I think will address some of the environmental concerns that society has with what we do as miners.
What kind of technologies have you used, in terms of, in terms of innovations, I guess? Have you used any of like AI technologies, blockchain technologies, or anything like in your projects?
My role when I was a CEO in charge of business, I stopped doing that in 2013. So, as an advisor, you can only, as they say in the classes, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Yeah.
So I have suggested to many of my companies the need to think about technology. I'll give an example. I was associated with a company that had a block cave mine. And as you know, with block caves, all your capital is up front because you develop the undercut, which beneath the ore body, and then you rely on the geotechnical aspects of the rock to collapse and come towards your draw points. And then based on your geotechnical model, you should be then drawing on various parts of the ore body based on that geotechnical model. I think that block caving is one of the earliest mining methods that you can automate and make it fully autonomous. And you could imagine that if you had on every shovel that went to every draw point, a sensor that could tell you what was the grade of the ore coming out of that draw point. So you would have now, because again, with the block cave, you drill it off, but once the cave starts to happen, you can try and predict how the rock is moving and coming down to your draw points, but it's a very imprecise method of trying to determine where the ore is going and where the dilution is coming from. But if you had a geotechnical model that informs you where you need to draw on the ore body, and then you had a geometallurgical model which actually looks at every scoop and every bucket of ore you take from a draw point and tells you exactly what the grade is there, you can then reconcile all of that through an automate system. And then you should be able to say, I take 1 scoop from that draw point, I take 2 scoops from that draw point, I take 3 scoops from that draw point, and you could automate that completely by having autonomous vehicles going and actually doing that through a computer program. And so I have suggested that to a company that I was involved with. But to your point earlier around why don't people want to do this, I think they had a very lean management organization. They were very focused on solving some immediate problems, and so they just didn't have the capacity to lift their heads and see that maybe what was being suggested through automation like that was going to actually be a savior for them as opposed to extra work. And unfortunately, when you're running your business on a firefight mode, you tend to continue to firefight. You don't step back and say, let me plan better. Let me try and access some tools and try and improve the way I run my business.
So would you say that maybe not most, but would you say that companies that, let's say, you are aware of all these technologies, you're aware what kind of benefits these technologies can bring, would you say that there is resistance within the companies to actually think about it strategically? Don't think about it in terms of short term. Okay, they're today I don't need it. Maybe tomorrow I also don't need it, but next month I might need it. Would you say that there is this type of resistance because of there is this old pattern of doing things and people don't really want to switch, even with the advisor like yourself?
No, I was a big time advisor, and yes, they wouldn't accept. So I think you're absolutely right there. I think there's an inability to see the advantage of these things. I think the other thing too, though, is one needs to translate some of these things into financial benefits, because you need to be able to pitch to the CEO and CFOs the value. So if you take consulting companies like McKinsey, Bain, all these, the 5 top auditing companies now, they are all selling services to the sectors, whether it be pharmaceutical, whether it be medical, whether it be even mining, and they're getting mining companies to pay them millions of dollars to consult. And so
Right.
when you look at and their pitch is always to the CEO, the CFOs, the sort of top echelons of companies, and their pitch is always in financial terms. So they make it very simple, and they show that cadre of leadership eye-watering numbers that they're going to deliver to the company. And I think that's where a lot of these technologies are falling foul, is they show technical solutions, but they don't show economic solutions. And I think you need to translate a lot of these technologies and these approaches into what does it mean to the bottom line, and you need to then pitch that to the C-suite, because when they see that pitch, they will adopt. And you've got to work it from the top down. At the same time, you've got to also build a relationship at operations, because they can actually sabotage your project if you don't make sure that they buy into. So you've got to work it at both levels, both at the operational level as well as at the corporate level. Make sure that the message has got across to both levels of the company.
Yeah, final question from me. I mean, it's kind of like a more, I guess, speculative question, because I had discussion with a friend of mine who's like a senior geologist for like 50 years, and his claim is that in terms of the climate change, mining industry doesn't really have a significant impact as opposed to like other factors. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think one can get into a big downward spiral on this discussion, but I do believe there is a need for energy transition, and I use that word selectively. I don't talk about climate change, because we can argue about that forever, whether there is or isn't, and I don't think that's something that's very useful. So I do believe that we need to have an energy transition, and I use the word transition because one cannot take the energy sources of today and just switch them off and then flip over and switch on the other energy sources. So I think we need to, between now and 2050, we need to actually have a very clear program of how we're going to transition our energy. I do believe that our grid system is highly inefficient. And I think we need to redesign how we supply electrons, whether it be to a person in the street or whether it be to a business. And I always look at the cell phone as a disruptor. And you think about the telecommunications world, where a landline was the only device that you could use to communicate on.
Yeah.
And when you look at the advent of a cell phone, it's now no longer a cell phone, it's a mobile device, because it's become more than just a communication device. And I think when you look at energy, because we have developed this grid system that's highly inefficient and highly complex, I think that has to be changed. And so, I believe in thinking about microgrids, and I think a combination of energy systems. So, the biggest consumer, certainly in Canada, my experience, the biggest consumer of peak power is the population. So when a person comes home and decides it's a hot day and switches on the air conditioner, the grid has to respond by supplying the electrons so that the person can run the air conditioner. So you've got this very complex power supply system that is being pulled upon to supply peak power demands because of the man in the street, the person in the street. And I think that's a flaw in our system. So we have a lot of latent capacity in our sector, which is just there to supply that peak power. But it could be running 24/7, but it doesn't, because it's needed for that peak power. And we've even got one of the companies I'm with, we've got what they call peakers, and it stands idle all the time. And when they need peak power, the regulator calls us and says, switch on, and we supply the power, and we get paid incredible amount of money so we can keep the thing standing for all year. Those are things that I think through this energy transition need to be done. The second thing in mining is many times our sites are remote. And so when you think about the grid um, ability to take power from an existing infrastructure hundreds of kilometers to a mine, it doesn't make sense, because when you look at your line losses over that transmission line, it's just wasted electricity where you're losing electricity by moving electrons down a very inefficient system. So I think there are solutions, whether it be small nuclear reactors, whether it be wind turbines and batteries, whether it be solar and batteries. I think there are solutions to remote locations, whether it be for in industry and or society, where you've got small towns where
Yeah.
they don't, and again in Canada, we have people that don't have access to electricity even, or in Africa, there'll be a lot of communities that don't have access to electricity. I think
Yeah.
and therefore there's going to be a big demand on metals to be able to do that, to supply that energy. So I do believe that we do need to focus on an energy transition, and it does require think about wind, solar, battery, nuclear, hydro, and those are those will be energy sources, hopefully, that are better for the environment as a consequence.
Perfect. Ian, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insight.